Hey guys, welcome to WWJT episode 15. This is a unique episode because it's not just an expert, but it's also a friend. We've interviewed experts before, like TGC's Wyatt Graham and Jason Thacker and Ruth Cuthbert, and we've interviewed some friends of mine who work in tech, like Scott and David Deepwell and Hayden. And so this one is a friend of mine who's also an expert. James Kelly. He's the founder and CEO of FaithTech, and he's got a cool story, and we jumped into a whole bunch of different topics, so I hope you enjoy listening. The audio quality, not as good on this one because I screwed it up trying to figure it out how to do it in person. It gets really funky around the 43-minute mark, so if you make it that far, you'll get to hear the funk, and I really hope you enjoy the episode.
Well, thanks, Andrew. Looking forward to this, man. It's fun.
Well, thanks for joining, James. Welcome to WWJT. What would Jesus tech? We're trying to figure out what Jesus would do if he lived today. And this is our first in-person episode, so we got a system in my family room figured out.
It's amazing.
So you've been here before. We know each other way back when you started FaithTech, and you have this story about starting at a coffee shop, and I was one of the people who got this really cryptic invite of there's this thing happening, do you want to come?
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about that from your perspective. Like, were you scared? Like, you're going into this thing of this technology world, and it's not
I
like
don't know anything about technology.
Well, you're a user of technology,
Right,
but
right.
it's not like,
Yeah, I mean, it's so cool to be chatting because you were at that first meetup, which was, I think, so unexpected. I mean, I've told the story of that first meetup thousands of times, but it actually is, like, it really was so special to me. You had 35-ish people that are in this coffee shop, and I remember, like, we were praying, like, I was literally like, Lord, like 10 to 15. This would be amazing. And all these people that just kept coming in, and I'm like, why are you here? And they're like, well, we heard this intersection between, like, technology, and there wasn't the name FaithTech, I don't think yet. It was just like people that are interested in Jesus and technology, and we should really chat with each other. And I think it was really significant for me because a few things happened that night that I think really helped me understand this could be something more than just like this one get together.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of them was, there was 3 guys from a company called Desire to Learn just down the street from you here.
Yeah.
And they show up, and I remember 2 guys look at each other and they're like, what are you doing here? And he's like, well, what are you doing here? It's like, well, I follow Jesus. You do? These guys they work together. Yeah. These guys were like 2 seats down. And that group, though, they actually formed a group. They started meeting on a weekly basis. To this day, those guys are still connecting.
Wow.
To do, like, how do we live out our faith at work? And, we ended up building different, like, curriculums to different books. And it was just such a cool thing that I couldn't believe that these guys got a chance to meet each other. And then that formed a depth of relationship that's endured for years.
So community building amongst tech people. That's like right. Very core to FaithTech.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And it's working off of this idea of, like, so many people working in tech feel isolated and alone in their faith, And then there's this second piece to it, which is, like, I also feel underutilized with this unique talent that God's given me, right? Like, I had one guy summarize it best to me once. He's like, I go to church and no one understands my work, right? I speak in a different language. I code. No one understands that. They think, like, if I work at, like, Twitter or I work at, Google or something, there's a lot of evil. My preacher keeps, like, just hammering social media without context.
Get off your phone. You're addicted.
Right. And buddy's sitting there going, I work at Facebook.
Yeah.
Like, what do I do with that? So going to church, no one understands their work, and then going to work and no one understands their faith. Being like, I go to work and the belief system of the tech industry is hyper counter to the belief system I follow.
Right.
And so therefore, if I share my faith or I'm open about my faith, it's like a detriment to my work, and it's very scary to do so. And therefore, am I the only one that is feeling this way. And then not sharing the faith then doesn't open up the opportunity to find others of faith. So then it leads people down a path of like, well, I'm the only believer at my company or in the city working in tech. And the reality is like, it's just not true. You know, there's other believers that are trying to wrestle through this stuff, working in this industry. And so going back to the coffee shop, it was like, wow, people are meeting each other, but instantly they're like, wow, you feel that the same way too. And then at the coffee shop, there was like pastors, right? And there was like ministry leaders running charities, Christian charities.
They want to use technology to expand their scope.
And understand it and like solve problems. And they're all struggling. I think this is like, to me, when I step back and I'm like, what's God doing through FaithTech? I think FaithTech's part of a bigger movement God's doing in the world, where two things have hit at the same time, which is charities, churches are feeling it more than ever. Pandemic accelerated that, of like, we need to understand and utilize technology for the glory of God. How do we do that? How do we understand it? It's complex, but we need to do something. And then believers in tech going, I can do more in PowerPoint to advance the gospel here with this unique talent that is impacting and shaping the world more powerfully than perhaps any other industry. And so what can I do? And how do I do that with others? And then the answer to both of their problems is each other. Like, that's what's so unique about that, is like, you're not going to solve your problem as ministry leaders on your own. You're not going to solve your problems as tech people just by getting together on your own and then just talking. If you can actually build two, that's a depth that's going to be beautiful for you. And so when they actually start learning together and building together, it's like, everyone's like, oh man, we're getting all these deep problems we're trying to get solved by being unified, you know, and working together. So, and
that's where, within the broader scope of FaithTech, one thing that I worked with you for a time was FaithTech Labs, trying to figure that out. You know, so I'm meeting at a coffee shop, trying to get these people together and not really knowing exactly, like we would talk about it. We'd be like, oh, maybe we could do this. Do we want to go like Bible study curriculum route? Do we want to go like building super early? And then we'd get people from the University of Waterloo entrepreneurship system being like, well, this is the way you should build an ecosystem for entrepreneurship. And so you're trying to wrap all this in. But very vivid for me is one night, not enough people showed up. I'm like, man, we got to advertise more. But I have this guy coming in from Toronto who's with World Vision. He's like trying to figure out problems across the world. And he has a list of like 20 problems. Right. And I was hoping there'd be like 10, 20 people, and there's like 5. You know, it's like, okay, well, let's meet. Let's talk to these 5 people. And he goes through the list and he's like, oh yeah, the last thing on the list is water bottles, like massive problem. Yes. Water bottles. What are we going to do with all these water bottles that aren't recycled in these other countries, and they end up stacking? So it'd be great if we could figure out what to do with them. Right. And this engineer's like, oh, well, you just turn it into rope. and I was like dumbfounded. The World Vision guy is dumbfounded. But it's an engineer who's like, well, yeah, obviously water bottles can be turned into rope. And this is the need for these groups and communities to merge, is so that those conversations can happen. And so they end up 3D designing this little thing that World Vision now can use in order to take this little, it's almost like a pencil sharpener, but not. Like it uses a razor blade from a shaver so that it's available all over, but then 3D printed otherwise. And so it's just a very cool use of technology to, I guess you'd classify that somehow, because you have this classification. How would you classify that? Is that responsible tech? Is that redemptive tech?
Or exploitative? Yeah, so we took this way of thinking that combined what we've been thinking about for years, came across a great organization called Praxis. They're all about helping advance this vision of redemptive entrepreneurs. And we're really closely connected with them. And they have this framework of thinking about the world and business in terms of there's exploitative, they use exploitative, ethical, and redemptive. And then when we look at tech, we think, wow, there's exploitative tech, responsible tech, and redemptive tech. And it's asking multiple questions of each. So not just the tool itself that's exploitative, but the methods used and then the belief set that sits under it. So the other framework that goes with it is like we talk about the beliefs that sit within the tech industry, the methods of how you build a product, and then the actual product itself. And all three of those things can be exploitative, responsible, or redemptive. But the worldview of tech industry goes, the furthest we go is responsible tech, which is like, I win, we win. Exploitative is I win, you lose. Responsible is I win, we win. Redemptive is I sacrifice, we win. It's a whole nother way of thinking on what you believe about yourself and in the tech industry. When it's redemptive, you're like, well, I give of myself to my colleagues in my workplace, not so that I gain, but that the end goal is giving of myself, which you see obviously perfectly exampled in Jesus Christ, gives of himself entirely.
Right.
Even the way you build, right? The methodology, you go, if it's exploitative, then all your tactics are so that you get something back. If it's responsible, you are at least thinking about other people, so you both win, which is still good.
Right.
But again, that's as far, like all those methodologies will end with I win, we win for the world. But when you look at a biblical lens, you go, okay, you'll actually create a product in a way that will be uniquely redemptive, so sacrificial, and that is challenging. So an example would be in our labs projects, we really encourage our people to take a moment early on in building the product to take an evening of lament. And it's literally encouraging our people to stop and say, let's try to understand this problem. Let's see our role in this problem we're trying to solve, because you probably are playing a role in some way. And then let's cry out to God that he helps us feel it, and then he changes what's happening. And it's just like this beautiful biblical way of introducing lament into the process of building a product. You are now training people to bring a redemptive methodology into the process of building. Another unique thing we do is in design thinking, we always ask, like, how might we build this thing? How might we solve this problem? So we encourage our people to go, how might Jesus?
What would Jesus?
What would Jesus tech?
Thank
of course.
you. Appreciate the shout out.
So what would Jesus, like, it really is like, how might Jesus build this thing? How might Jesus approach this problem? How might Jesus, and it does reorient and recontextualize our thinking and how we build a product. And so, yeah, I think like, wow, it's a long way to answer that one question, which is like, yeah, you look at these products and some products being built are responsible, which is amazing. Some products are exploitative and we need to reject those things and expose those things. And then we as FaithTech want to build as many products as we can that are redemptive, that are helping people know Jesus or meet Jesus, or help build things for the church that are like going to help local churches advance their calling, their mission. And the last thing to say is the reason, though, like that sounds simple. It's like, oh, that's a cool framework. And then you look at examples like Facebook and you're like, it's all three. You're like, what they're like, and they have in multi-layered, in both the belief, elements of their belief is all three. Elements of their methodology, you could argue, include all three elements. Especially when you're like, I know believers working there that are seeking out to do this extraordinarily redemptively. And then what they produce and how they like extract from people, money based off of the data.
Psychological analysis gets you addicted. They make more money.
Right.
There's all that stuff going on.
And then you go, oh, wow. And then that church just leveraged the technology to bring 5 people to their building who heard the gospel and got saved.
Well, yeah,
you're like,
the missionaries that we know, like it seems to be a common theme. I heard it with Jake Meter the other day where he was describing stories in Iran. It's like the fastest growing church in the world. And it's like so driven by technology. It's just like, because they're able to put ads and have people click, and people are like, yeah, for the last year I've been having dreams. So glad to talk to a Christian. It's like the technology is allowing this to happen and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So clearly Facebook can be used for good, even on a personal level, taking care of someone with disabilities, taking care of that. The Facebook groups are so helpful for me to connect with other people who are struggling with similar needs, and how do you take care of people with this, that, or the other thing. So it's tough when we so want to just simplify it and say this is good or this is bad.
Yeah.
Even FaithTech, it's like, is FaithTech pro-technology or anti-technology? Like, can you answer that? Like,
good question. Yes.
Because you clearly, there's some tech that's exploitative that you're against, and you're trying to make us more aware of those exploitative tendencies.
I had someone just yesterday ask me a very good question, which he said, what are people within FaithTech that start learning about the way you're talking? What do they do? Do they all leave their company?
Right.
Or are they all staying? Or like, what do they do next? And I just said experientially, both are happening. Where like some people are going, now that I've learned this and I see more of this, I'm more motivated to stay because God's called me as a missionary to Google. He's called me as a missionary to this tech startup. And if all the believers leave, I'm like, then you're taking away so much of the redemptive opportunity to impact that. It was like when Twitter was public.
Back in the day,
Paul Burns was the managing director of Twitter in Canada.
Let him go? Is this the case?
I don't have all the details, but
and who knows?
He's not there anymore.
When we post the podcast, there's a million other things will change. And Twitter will be like paid only.
Right.
You got to pay the $8 a month, and then otherwise you're just not on the platform. I don't know what's happening. Nobody knows.
I'm waiting for a tweet from Elon that's like, we have a new name. It's like we're lying or something. That's totally different. Anyway, so when he was at Twitter and
head of Twitter Canada,
executive, this guy openly and is deeply in love with Jesus, become a good friend, and he's like genuinely is like, missionary. That was his, like, I'm here. It's super messy. Like the whole Trump thing, he was like engaged in those conversations. He's like, this is really, really messy. But he's like, that's the calling of a believer, is to be in the mess.
Right.
So for him, he was like, no, I want to stay. Even when people were like, how could you possibly support that? And he's like, I just have a different, like the way I see the Gospels, the way I see Scripture calls me to a different way. And I love that. I deeply love that. But I also respect when people hit a moment and they're like, there's just so much exploitative elements of the company to which I work for. And again, usually when they say that, it's not just a tool, it's also including methodology, it's including belief set, that it's scarring their soul to the point where they're like, this is taking me so far away from Christ. It's like that whole missional mentality of like when the whole missional movement really started building up over, you could say 30 years ago, and we were moving almost like this growing movement away from megachurch. We're like, no, we need to like go into the pubs to live out the gospel. Now you have a lot of these leading missiologists who are looking back and being like, it seems like a lot more people became like the pub than converted those in the pub.
Right.
And it's like, maybe that didn't work either, And so it's like even reconsidering that. And there's like some people could go into that pub context with enough accountability and enough support as a team and live out the light of Christ. So if you go in on your own and you're struggling with X, Y, and Z, like an alcohol problem, and that's a deep, painful thing in your past, and you go into it, there's a high likelihood that's actually not a great context for you. And so translating that analogy over to tech is like, it's not the right environment if you realize your company's exploitative, both a combination of belief, methodology, and tool, then you should get out.
Yeah, you gotta be a missionary where you're at, but also use wisdom to question where you're at, too. Paul got out of jail when he was able to. When he's like, it's like, well, Paul, you were doing a great prison ministry there. It's like, well, there's other things that are going to be good for the kingdom too. Point. So I'm going to move on. Like we got to.
Angel? No, I'm good.
Yeah, you don't say no to the angel.
No, yeah. Open up the door? No, I'm good.
One thing I'll say, like in seeing you, like I've been involved with FaithTech at various points in time, and so I remember there's at least 5-6 points where I'm like, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with FaithTech. Like, there's so many challenges that you've had to go through. Pandemic, figuring out, because you had a lot of in-person gatherings that now you have restrictions. So you're trying to figure out the online thing. It's like, well, aren't you equipped to do online? It's like, yeah, but you had a model that was very in-person. You also just like the ups and downs of some hackathons are better attended than others. Some volunteers are more committed than others. And, including myself, I quit after a year of volunteering with you. It's like, well, it was easy to volunteer when I was on pat leave, but now that I'm back at a tech company, maybe I'll slow it down. So I'm like, what keeps you going through those difficulties? Why haven't you? Because I think if I were in your position, I would have been like, okay, FaithTech was a fun thing for a year or two. Right. What are you on? Like year 4, year 5? 6?
We're starting year 7 right now, on the 7th year.
So like, what's keeping you going, especially in those hard moments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the formative part of doing FaithTech has been, like, I've realized really in the last 6 months, more than I did even before, is that the technology element for me is really important, but it's like the primary cultural, powerful example of what God's called me to do, which is help disciple people in knowing Jesus. And so because my calling is fundamentally help people know Jesus for the first time or know him more deeply. That is my calling, right? I look at what God's been forming out of FaithTech that feels so much like why on earth am I doing this? Again, it's like starting FaithTech is like I was a user of technology. Yeah. But
you were recruiting, you had an MDiv, you were helping lead a church plant.
Yeah. And still to this day, when people find out I can't code, they're like, what? Why can't you code? And I'm like, I really can't do a lot of technology. Even yesterday, the teams, I had 2 people around me trying to figure out this mail merge thing, and I felt like an idiot. But again, that's the technical side of it. I think there's a cultural, philosophical, theological side that I'm really passionate about. And so because of that, as FaithTech's gone on, I've been amazed at learning at how both dark technology can be. Yeah. Extreme loneliness, extreme isolation, addiction at a totally different level than we've ever seen in history. Mass cultural addiction, and it's harming people at rates we've never seen. And all of this insane stuff, when you learn around technology, how dark this rabbit hole goes, it's painful to watch. And then on the other side, so that's motivating, because you're like, wow, that's such a core element of, again, if the calling is discipling people to know Jesus, and this is a primary barrier to that journey, we need to understand it, and we need to speak into it, and we need to learn about it. And who knows that best? It's builders that are creating it. Right. So the learning that I've gained from my friends that are working in tech that understand this at a level that is beyond my understanding, but give me insights, I'm that's been so extraordinarily helpful for me to then take a lot of that knowledge and create this platform of community where people could then start actually that discipleship journey together, to go more deeper in helping us deal with this struggle that so much of the world is dealing with, right? And so, Yeah, I would say like the discipleship opportunities. And then I think God is just uniquely, like, I'm constantly thinking at scale. And that's not like, it doesn't feel like a bad thing. It feels like, wow, God's built me in ways to think like, oh, okay, if it's working here, how can it work in 100 other cities around the world? So it can serve 100, tens of thousands of more people.
It's kind of a fun problem to try to solve.
Right.
Like it's like not a Rubik's Cube, because I find those boring, but pick your video game or whatever, like you have difficult problems to solve.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's been a lot of fun. And there's elements that, like, if I'm honest too, I'm having a lot of fun. Like, there's challenges, no doubt, but like, I'm having a lot of fun with this too. I think it's just enjoyable. A lot of elements of it are enjoyable. Yeah,
I think both you and I have wives that are very supportive of what we end up doing with our time, including a podcast like this. Right. To have that support is just great, even though it's like this hobby thing on the side for me, right?
It's like when FaithTech started, Karen's like,
what is this?
What are you doing? And she's like, you're taking all these like breakfast meetings and lunch meetings and you're talking about technology, right? And I'm like, I know, I don't know what it is, but God's doing something. And so when she came to that first meetup that we had, and there's all these pictures of that first meetup, and then there's like Karen, my wife, with our son in like the he's 7 now, right? And that's when we got home, and she's like, that was something. She's like, do you know what just happened there? I was like, no, not really. But like, God was doing something really interesting. Yeah. So like, and she was just like, all right, we got to keep going with that,
Yeah, that totally helps too. I've been on a similar journey in some ways, seeing just how, like you described, how bad tech is, so to speak, like how exploitative the exploitative technologies are. Mm-hmm. And, it's just, you start to realize, how our culture is shifting. Neil Postman's got his, like, the television is terrible, and you're like, oh, come on, like, the television. It's like, no, we've shifted from a text-based society to an image-based society, a society that went from, digesting arguments and back and forth to, like, now I heard you talk about, like, people don't consume speeches very much anymore, right? Like, we've lost rhetoric because we're more image-based. Podcasts are one of the few forms that exist still of long discussion. But yeah, it's like we're really struggling as a society when it comes to tech. And like some people, there's an article in the Atlantic recently, like is this the end of social media, right? Like you got the metaverse is the focus of Elon Musk, and everybody admits it's like, this is really weird. Like employees at Meta are questioning it. And you got all these stories of like Facebook's going down, Twitter's going down, everybody's back. I don't think it's going down. We'll see what Musk does. There's a lot of this like pushback. Like, do you have a sense, working as much as you are, of like what the future holds? Like, is there a growing backlash against tech that is rising, against especially the exploitative types of technology? I don't know. Can you predict the future, James?
Yeah, that's right. Of course I can. Here I go, and the world will end on this. No, I'm just kidding. That's a great thing to think about. Yeah, it's interesting to think, like, I thought when I got into FaithTech and learned more about this, I actually thought you would start seeing the rise of the no-tech church movement, which I don't know exists. I mean, it'd be hard to find out.
I guess the Amish community, the Mennonite, old Mennonites.
Right. Actually, I love, like, there's so much to learn from Mennonite Amish communities, because the way they even approach technology is hyper-communal in their decision-making, which I think is deeply missed within our hyper-individualistic society, where we go, well, I'll decide if I get a phone or not, and I'll decide which phone it is for myself. It's like, when did that become a good idea? Right. To think that way. So there's that community side of decision-making as a side note to that I think we should be adopting as a Christian community. But the way forward, I think the challenge with this is you're pushing up against a very deep cultural addiction. Right. And so, like, I do think there's signs right now of people realizing, wow, we've like gone down this path that is leading to our destruction. In many respects, not all respects, but in some respects, where it's like, yeah, spouses spend less time together. It's extraordinarily common that before bed, a husband and wife are sitting there and they're on their phone for a half hour.
Yeah.
And like, that's my favorite time of my day. Is just before bed with my wife, just chatting about the day, and like to imagine that I let technology into my bedroom to disrupt that moment is like, of course we'd be talking about divorce in a year.
Right.
Because we just stole the best time of the day from both our lives. And so I do think there's signs right now where people are realizing that addiction has been pulling us away from each other, from depth of person. This is my big thing of why I question the future of VR and the metaverse.
Right.
Is because it's all centered around how do we digitize the beauty of human experience. Rather, like if you actually look at Zuckerberg's address, you can break down that every feature they're introducing is, here's what's working face to face, so let's digitize it.
Right.
Instead of going, it's working face to face. Like, that's good. Like, let's do more of that. And so I think that's going to be the ultimate, I think, fault. And the fact that goggles make you look like an idiot.
They do.
Kevin Kelly said that actually about VR like 10 years ago. He's like, I don't think it'll work yet because as humans, we're so sinful in that we care so much about how we look.
Yeah.
That stupid looking goggles, unless they progress rapidly away from that, it would be a hard thing, I think, to sell to society. But
I've totally thought about my cold sore on my lip about 10 times since we pressed record. Like, it's a fact that we care too much about how we look.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And so and there's signs of this, like you know this, a few years ago, I had a moment with my son where I was in the living room on my phone and he's trying to get my attention. He couldn't get my attention. And he literally came up to me. He's like, Dad, get off your phone. And I was like, wow. And then I took a digital Sabbath. So a whole day, 24 hours, no digital technology.
After we said goodbye.
Right. I threw it out the window. And so I did a digital Sabbath. It was extremely legalistic. It was like, here's the list. You can use a fridge still. You can use a toaster oven. You cannot use a cell phone. You cannot use a computer. You cannot use a screen. And it was a digital Sabbath, and it was phenomenal. Like, it was so much more time with the family, time reading, and reading as a medium, like physically reading versus digital reading, has been proven to help you go deeper.
Right.
And so, like, that just whole experience, and then I did it multiple weeks. I was like, this is so freeing and so good for me. And so then we put a little team together in FaithTech, and we started to build a website, and we called it the Digital Sabbath Challenge. Can you go one day a week for 1 month without digital technology? And put a little button on it. People can give their email. We remind them and all this kind of stuff. And we just did this thing. It was like 70 people doing it. And then I remember one morning, it was a few years ago, I logged into my email. It was like 700 people signed up.
Wow.
I'm like, obviously something happened. So I Google search it. New York Times does an article on this concept of digital Sabbath.
Wow.
And mentions our little website.
Wow.
And then you're like, all of a sudden, all these people are signing up. And that article was massive because he was addressing a core hurt and idolatry of society, which is like, I can't get off of my digital technology. And now I think societally, people are starting to recognize, how it's hurting themselves and others around them, and therefore looking around for solutions.
Right.
And so I think there's something to that, where I think we're hitting certain moments here as a broad-based culture where we are realizing some of the negative effects of this technology.
And it's interesting, like, already you've talked about lament, Sabbath, I know in being a friend of yours that prayer is central to who you are as a person. Like I knew that if I started the podcast without praying with you, that like you would be like, hey, why don't we pray? Just because you would make sure. And I really appreciate about you. And you genuinely care about people. You follow up with them. You're the guy who like has people in his phone that you text and you try to care about their soul, not just their work for you. And I've appreciated that working for you. And I think about like these ancient models that Jesus practiced. What would Jesus tech? But like lament, right? Like what if we solved problems by lamenting them to God first? What if we addressed this world first by addressing God? What if instead of, focusing on the next thing we can do and get done, we realize that some of the best things you could do biblically, according to the 10 Commandments, one of the top 10 things you could do is not do something for a day.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's
like it's in the top 10.
That's an interesting way of putting it too.
So you think about, just what these ancient ways of living, and I call them ancient, but obviously they're proven, tested, written for our good across time.
Yeah.
What are other tips? What are other strategies that you're doing? I like how we're going in this direction on the pod. I wasn't necessarily thinking about it, but like, I think there's just a lot there. And how do we live differently? How do we approach tech while seeing it's good, building it, while also like restricting its exploitative nature?
Yeah, and this is the value of habits and boundaries. James K. Smith writes this great book, You Are What You Love, years ago, right? And the whole concept of that book is like the things you do shape what you love, right? And I think so much of Christianity and in our preaching and our teaching, we say, if you just change the heart, everything else will work.
Right.
But we don't actually address the fact that you can work to actually change some of the heart. And now there's a danger in that. You can hyper move into legalism, and then that's all you focus on. So you have to still speak both. But like, just look at our life. And we know if we can include good boundaries and include good habits, it's like, so my son's birthday, 7th birthday was this week. And my wife made a cake, right? And so the first night we cut up the cake and we all eat a big slice, and we're sitting there and the cake's on the middle of the table, and we're like looking at each other. I'm like, can I have a second one? Like, this was so good.
Yeah.
And Judah's like, I want a second one. But then my wife's like, well, let's save the cake for another day. And so she picks it up, takes it down to the basement, puts it in a fridge. And suddenly I'm like, I'm okay. I don't need a cake anymore. I'm like, because it's gone. Right. It's just not there. I don't actually see the cake anymore. And so I'm not being reminded constantly of, I want this delicious cake, because we've actually done a physical thing to remove it from the table.
Can you get cake after this? Just on the topic.
Amazing. And so it's the same when you look at like habits we form and boundaries we put in place. And so like boundaries, like there's so many good healthy ones. Andy Crouch's book, Tech Wise Family, lays out the way his family's been trying to do this. And just a variety of habits that I've learned or have tried would be things like, don't let technology in bedrooms. It's like, do not let a phone, a screen, computers into your bedroom. Like for me, being married, we've been married 13 years now, my wife and I, and we go, no computers, like no phones, like don't let that in.
Yeah.
Because this is a space of intimacy. This is a space where we get our time just to chat and be together. And so that's healthy. It also, then when you wake up, the first thing you're not doing is checking a cell phone, which 75% of young adults within 5 minutes of waking up will check cell phone, which is like, conceptually, even as a married man, I'm like, the first thing I'm thinking about waking up, if that's my habit, is what random person just like tweeted me overnight versus like kissing my wife good morning. That's a huge difference in how you're starting your day.
Yeah.
I
don't post a lot of pictures online. That's my conscience that I just don't want to do that with my kids. And I think it would be a cool present when my daughter turns 14 or whatever. That's like, hey, you know how you know about the internet now and you can search? There's no pictures of you on the internet.
Beautiful.
Like, that's a present that we want to give to you. So when you turn 14, that you have something special, cool. That your online identity is yours. You get to decide that for yourself. Yeah. But yeah, just like this need for recognition, this need to be valued. And you get those hits with that notification. You get that hit. And so, the practices sometimes go ahead of the heart. I remember first hearing that and being like, wait, James K. Smith, like, is this a biblical thing? But you look at the Sermon on the Mount, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Yeah. Wait. No, it's where your heart will be, there your treasure will be. Jesus, you said that wrong. It's like, no. Jesus doesn't misstate things, especially in Scripture, guys. And then you also, just the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, you have a lot of things that seem like legalism. Yeah. Hey, what are you doing praying in public? Close the door. Pray privately in your room. So you don't get distracted and caught up in how other people are hearing your prayers. It's a practice in order to check where your heart is by first closing the door and doing it privately in your room, so that you will develop a real relationship with God, not just a show for others.
And I think it gives an opportunity. Obviously, you're working on this. There's an element of individual shaping towards Christ-likeness, but it's also a very powerful testimony, like, to live countercultural. Like, we're talking as a team right now around, like, what's our rhythm of sabbatical an organization. And we're talking about, like, what does that rest look like for us as organizationally, creating policy around a radical view towards rest.
It's like 2 weeks vacation a year is one example policy.
Right.
So what are you trying to
do? We're talking about like a 3-month sabbatical once you've hit 5 years. And sabbaticals are a really beautiful concept, actually. And I learned more about this from Andy Crouch recently. We were talking about sabbatical, and he said, he's done 3 of these in his life, and all of them produce like some of his best thinking that he's written a bunch of books on. And he said, if you do a sabbatical, say 3 months, here's what I recommend is like, first month, rest. He's like, just rest and sleep. Like, you've been working for 7 years, take a break, rest. I told him one of my favorite quotes is actually a Jewish proverb that says, those who work with their hands should Sabbath with their minds, and those who work with their minds should Sabbath with their hands. And it's the idea that, like, I work with my mind all day, strategy, emails, meetings, and it's like to be able to go home and like build something with my kids.
I got some Lego for you
right now. Yeah, there we go. Actually, we can start working on that as we talk. Is like actually rest for my whole person, my whole body, And so I love that concept. So he's like, month 1, rest. Month 2, pilgrimage. So he's like, go somewhere to expect to experience God. So it'd be something that is probably abnormal for you, something you typically wouldn't do. Maybe it is like family stuff that you can do.
Month 2 is hear from God. Go to experience God. And then month 3, now that you're rested, you've experienced God. Now listen to God. Listen to what he's going to say to you about the future, about what's next, about who you're supposed to be, where you're supposed to lean in, strategy for your company, whatever that is.
So we're going to have to cut that off there. Certainly some funky audio issues that we'll hope to have resolved in the future. He went on to make some great points about the Sabbath, how God created Adam and Eve, and then the very next day they rested. Like, what if the first thing we did was rest? What if that was a mindset? We rest first, or there's like this renewal, then retrieve, James said it better. So if you want to hear more from James, you'll have to subscribe to his podcast, the FaithTech podcast. Just look it up, FaithTech, in your podcast app. You'll find it. Check out faithtech.com. Get connected. If you work in tech and you want to use your skills for the kingdom of God, you want to volunteer on the side, you want to make a startup or something like that. They got opportunities for you there. It is worth your time and worth your attention, even just subscribing to their mailing list to see what's going on internationally with FaithTech. So I encourage you to do that. I thank you for listening. You can support us by letting people know that you enjoyed this episode and sharing this episode with others. I would very much appreciate that, and you can subscribe if you so desire to hear more of us. Well, not me and James, but me and Joel normally talking about what would Jesus tech. And we encourage you to use tech to find rest and to glorify God. Take care.